Erik Jensen, welcome to Booktopia.
Thank you.
Now, you've written this very unorthodox biography of Adam Cullen called Acute Misfortune. What does the title refer to?
The title came out of the first interview I had with Adam, which was not for the book, in fact. It was for a profile piece I was writing when I used to work at the Sydney Morning Herald. And at the very end of the interview, he told me with certainty that he was going to die, and unbuttoned his shirt to make this point. He had this incredible scar that twisted the length of his torso, and these great drain holes that had never properly healed, so they sort of were deep pock marks on his stomach. And I sort of was, staggered by this. It hadn't happened in an interview to me before. So I sort of just asked what had happened to fill the silence. And his answer was acute misfortune. And I came to sort of think that it was an explanation for a whole lot of Adam's life.
Indeed it is. But I have to say, it's interesting that one of the things that comes across about him in your book is he's so quotable. He speaks in sound bites. Was that true?
It's actually something I think, because Adam spent so much time alone, he spent a whole lot of time burnishing the things he wanted to say. And I think by the time I met him, he was very certain that he wanted to say things that would be left behind. He had encouraged me into this friendship and into this book because he wanted someone to document things. He used to talk a lot about the final document. He referred to paintings as the final document. He would return to this idea of a residue that he would leave behind, and I think he wanted these quotes, these things he had to say, to be part of that residue.
So he really had a kind of preoccupation with his legacy, didn't he?
Absolutely. We talked early on, and I don't think it's in the book, but about Captain Beefheart, and Adam was an enormous fan of his, but also a fan of the way that he, for a time, disappeared and only later re-emerged. Adam was obsessed with this idea of being able to dip in and out of life, I suppose.
Well, he certainly did that with a vengeance. Look, he's obviously most well known for having won the Archibald with that portrait of David Wenham, but I have to ask you, he's quite an unpleasant character in a lot of ways. I found the book very, very confronting, particularly because of his views on women. Why should we care about Adam Cullen?
I think he's an interesting study in what it is Australia expects of its artists. Adam was an archetype. He, in fact, constructed a character for himself, a role that he would play, and it was the role of the wild man artist. Australia has a long history of fetishizing and mythologizing these kind of figures, and what interested me about Adam as a subject was that he was brilliant at cultivating this myth, and yet behind that was this whole great complex insecurity, and a lot of manipulation and a lot of mischief on his behalf, but also at the end, I think, quite a tragic figure. He was, in addition to being the wild archetype that people want of their artists, he was the innocent that people want of their artists. I think Australians assume that their painters are going to be brash and masculine, but also kind of untamed children.
But hearing you talk about him that way, what really strikes me is that sounds quite sort of objective and dispassionate, but in fact you were very close friends, and I'm wondering whether you think that in some ways you can be too close when it comes to biography.
Yeah, I wanted with this book to never look away. It started absolutely as an editorial project, and in the course of that, Adam and I became friends. I think eventually Adam mistook that friendship for love. But from the very beginning, I knew that what I wanted to do was to look at Adam as up close as possible, to record everything I saw, and to do it dispassionately. I knew that Adam was not a person to whom morals could be applied. It would be much too easy and much too boring to tell people what was wrong with his life. I sort of just wanted to see his life. Adam used to talk about what he painted, and he would say, he was a painter of human car crashes. And while other people look away from these crashes, he'd go right up close and see the blood. And that became something of a model for how I was approaching the book.
I'll say, the book is incredibly sort of visceral, and you talk about your friendship and then this kind of love affair. But he tested you so much. I mean, he shot at you at one stage to kind of test your commitment to this particular project. So I think most biographers at that point would have said, thank you very much, goodbye, and run screaming for safety. And he also threw you off the back of a motorbike.
Yeah.
So there's an incredible amount of violence in this book and in him as a person.
Yeah, violence for Adam was always interesting, I think, because he felt it was purely attention grabbing. There was nothing that could hold someone's attention or grab someone's attention the way being shot in the leg can or being thrown off a motorcycle can. I mean, this. He always wanted to try and find in his work the means of grabbing ultimate attention. His choice of colour was all about this. Adam was actually a very sensitive colourist. People don't see that in his work often, but these are not paintings drawn straight out of Jewel-X colour cans. Everything he painted, he mixed. He thought very deeply about colour, and it was all about attention. It was about how the painting could compete with television, how the painting could compete with life. He had an episode that I think traumatised him as a child. He was in the bush with his cousins, and a dog helped them capture a kangaroo off the side of a ute, and while the kangaroo was alive, they sawed off its tail with a chainsaw. And obviously it was no longer able to stand, and it was this sort of hugely violent act that emasculated this Australian symbol. And Adam felt always in his work some need to match that act. And at times when he'd tell that story he would laugh, but at other times he would cry. It was obviously a sort of a very dual episode for him in his mind. But it did crystallise in his mind also his interest in violence.
Now, what do you think winning the Archibald meant to Adam? Because on the surface of it, when you see someone who's so much of a bad boy, you would expect him to kind of shrug and be cynical about it and go, oh, that's just a kind of media circus and it's all hoopla and it doesn't matter. That was not his reaction.
No, it was the myth that he told later. He was flippant about the win over time. But at the time that he won the prize, it was the most electrifying moment of his life. He won that prize and he felt like it was acceptance. He had made all of this work that asked of people to reject him and felt rejected very often. And this was commercial and it was popular. And Adam's art was always tied up in Adam's celebrity. And the Archibald Prize was the point at which those two things intersected.
Absolutely, yes, complete convergence. We've talked a little bit before about how I found his attitude to women very confronting. You've talked about his ambivalence around his mother. How do you read and understand the awful things that he said about women, including women that he was having relationships with?
It's not something that he was ever able to articulate beyond what he said about women, what he said about his mother, the great sort of gulf he seemed to feel between how he lived his life and how those people who were closest to him wanted him to live his life. One of his long-term partners, Carrie Lumby, said to me after he died, and I think it's a brilliant insight, that what he hated about women was that he needed them. And certainly what he hated about his mother was that he needed her, that she had nourished him through his childhood, this blissful childhood that was much happier than he later wanted it to be. He wished he had come from some dark, difficult, complex place. He came from a joyous home on the northern beaches. But he held in contempt the nourishment that she'd given him as a child, and then held this peculiar jealousy where he felt that she had sacrificed her career for his childhood, and yet at the same time was hugely vicious with his success. I think he says at one point in the book, get over it, Mum, it's my name on the fucking flyer. And, this is just an extraordinary thing to think about, saying to the woman who at that point is simply wanting to embrace Adam's success.
So having written this very complex portrait of this really perverse and difficult and wild character, and having been a close friend of him, I want to know, what do you miss most about him now?
It's funny, I decided, as I said just earlier, to write the book without judgments, and I think I managed to write it without judgments. What I didn't manage was to write it without frustrations. There are a number of times in the book, I think, where almost like a gas valve, I couldn't help but vent some frustration about it out of. And I wrote the book entirely after he died, and at great speed after he died. And I think at times I wrote it with anger at the fact that he had died, even though this had been inevitable from our first meeting and hung over our entire friendship. It still upset me in a way I didn't expect it to, and also frustrated me in a way I didn't expect it to. But when I think then about what I really missed with Adam, I found him a hugely difficult character. I almost fled our friendship towards the end, so overwhelming and claustrophobic it had become. But I do miss his impish charm. He was a hugely funny, hugely charismatic person when he wanted to be, and he knew exactly when to turn that on. It's the moment after he throws you off a motorcycle and then comes back and smiling, grinning like a loon, asks you how that was. It's the moment where the black comedy was always necessary to offset the sometimes brutal aspects of his character.
Erik Jensen, thank you very much.